Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyree Boyd-Pates, and I am the Associate Curator of Western History at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Gabrielino, the Tonga people, and I want to thank all of you for the Autry's generous donors and members for making this program happen. I am honored, along with the Board of Trustees, to welcome you all to the Autry's Artist Salons on the Black Press in the American West. Joining me today is Angel Jennings, Assistant Managing Editor for Culture and Talent at the Los Angeles Times. Before we go any further, I would like to mention that if you have any questions during our conversation, please enter them at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of our Zoom window. Angel oversees MetPro, a program that helps beginning journalists launch careers and boost diversity in newsrooms, including other internship programs. She also works closely with other newsroom leaders and human resources and department heads to help track, recruit, and interview and select diverse candidates for job opportunities and advance the company's efforts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. Angel joined the Times 10 years ago and for several years was the only Black reporter in the department covering local and California news. She has extensively written about South LA, and her in-depth coverage of rapper and entrepreneur Nipsey Hussle's death continues to receive praise for discussing his role beyond just a musician and as a champion of the community where he grew up. Her story about Hussle's last moments was the Times' most read story in 2019. Angel, thank you for joining us for the Artist Salon.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Me too. Me too. We've been following each other's work for some time, and it only makes sense that we finally converge and convene.
I agree. I agree. I've been like admiring what you've done from afar, and so it's just so great to be in a space where we can like delve into conversations about the work that we've done and how we're both trying to essentially chronicle the history of Black people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's really going to be a treat for many of those who have interest in both of our works and the directions that it's heading. Again, for those, if you have questions during this conversation, please enter them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. For those who don't know, the Autry of the American West represents something slightly different to each of you who visits us physically and virtually. For me, as we continue our Collecting Community History initiative, I'm excited for today's program because it's highlighting the ways the Black press and the American West intersect, and Angel's work and journalism's power to tell authentic stories about the African American experience offers gems for all of us as visitors to present, represent, and purposely complicate traditional and modern visions of who in fact inhabits the American West. So let's dive in. Angel, you ready?
Yes, I am.
Awesome, awesome. So tell us about your background growing up in Washington, D.C., notably related to your career in journalism and designed to document the Black experience in Southern California and the West, and especially for the LA Times.
I'm actually in DC right now, a suburb of actually Washington, DC called Prince George's County, which is like one of the richest Black counties in the nation, which is so crazy that I moved to South LA, which also has a very rich area of history as well as wealth. And so I'm here and I grew up in DC all my life, moving around from like Alexandria, Virginia to the DC suburbs, and like the traditions and the things that I grew up that just felt innate, like summer and having crabs and conversation with family. Like, it's so crazy to me now that I work for a newspaper, but growing up, what I most remember about a newspaper is spreading them wide on a dinner table and throwing a barrel of crabs on there with potatoes and corn and diving in and grabbing these whole crabs and breaking them apart and getting to the meat and trying to be the first to finish them so then you can get your next one. Right. And so now as I return, I am often thinking about like how this history is shared and it has happened, and how do we preserve it and keep it and maintain that within our families. So as I have moved to the LA Times and moved to the LA, I've been in LA almost 10 years now, and so much of connecting the dots of like the Black diaspora, how so many of us came from the South, and like depending on how much wealth you had, it depends where you landed. My family landed in DC. Those who are more wealthier went to Chicago. They went to DC. Went to LA, which was like the promised land. And so it's like, as I'm telling rich stories of our history, it's so great connecting the dots from my own life and then seeing how that plays out and for LA in the American West.
Hmm. Hmm. And I've been inspired by your work because you've been able to highlight the different facets of Black life. And I'm curious to know, even probably based off your beat, what is your favorite aspect of covering it and why?
I love talking to people because oftentimes as you're talking to them, I don't think people recognize all that's hidden in them and the struggle and the survival and the joy. And like sometimes they never have that moment of reflection until they're able to tell that story to an outsider, someone who can help them, figure out what this stuff really means to them, or just by them talking and providing a listening, ear, they're able to come to those conclusions on their own. And I just love just like being able to share and get that trust to get people to open up and tell their stories. Like it just was such a joy to be able to talk to people about their lives, about their families, hear their secrets, hear their struggles, and then try to do something in a way that like do their story justice in a story form that shares it with a wider audience, to help us get an understanding of, as a people, as Americans, who we are, because oftentimes our stories aren't written in the books. So what we're doing now is like really the first draft of history, like trying to mine these stories and these traditions and getting them down on paper before they go, because people are dying. Like I'm here in DC because unfortunately I lost an aunt who was so dear to me. And as we are planning her funeral, we're thinking about the things she left us, and not material things. No, the stories, the lessons, the histories, and trying to write those down as fast as we can before life clouds that. And that's what me and you are doing in a different way. You through the arts and collecting of materials, and me through the storytelling form. And I just take such joy in being able to do that at work and being able to get paid to do it.
And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because e- even though I'm a museum curator and you're a journalist,
Mhm.
we're essentially working at two of the same intersections in reclaiming the stories of those who tend to get erased and omitted through narrative. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, through your work at the LA Times, how does reclamation play in rewriting the future of Black people in the American West, especially regarding representation? I'm sure you have a lot to say about
Yeah,
that.
there's just so much about reclaiming that. But first, it's the acknowledgement of what was lost and what role the press played in that. Like, yes, like LA Times has been around for 100 plus years. Same with so many other storied institutions and newspapers of records. But oftentimes, people like us weren't at the seat telling stories and going into these communities and editing the work. And you can tell when the writing is authentic and on the ground versus making a call, and how whether someone knows is part of that culture, and help ask the right questions that lead to a telling detail that really helps us get to the bottom of, like, again, reclaiming that history, bringing it to the surface, connecting those dots. And so it's like we're in a whole new almost like era right now, where so much of what was lost, we're realizing that we cannot keep letting generations of information slip from us, and that we must get these stories on paper, that we must share them, we must celebrate them, that we like, it's no longer okay to just like keep pressing forward without talking about some of what was done to us in the past, and then looking at the historical perspective of why Black people are in certain situations, why we live in certain neighborhoods, like the redlining, why, we have mass incarceration, because the policies around, war and drugs and so many other things. This history is about like not just, reclaiming, but also putting things in perspective, because we know that the same things happen to other communities, but for us, it just it's long lasting and devastating. And so it's about us just like really owning our stories and telling them our way in a way that's unapologetic without having to do all this explaining. Just put on paper what our stories are, and hoping that other people would do the work to like also understand us as well.
Powerful. So you're almost saying that the ways to reclaim our stories is first taking ownership of it,
Mhm.
especially the things that got lost, and then telling it in a way that is true to our voice and doesn't compromise the tone in an unapologetic way. So deep.
Boom. Just
Boom.
like that.
Boom. And that helps me to ask the follow-up question because I'm curious to know how you frame that reclamation into the newspaper, right? Like because even having an unapologetic tone is an art form itself in being able to translate it both from the person to the page. So, any comments on the framing or how you do that so effectively?
Framing is so important because like, when we think it's just a word that just like, I find that as I now have a class of summer interns that I'm working with and helping to, get them to be like, to the next level in their careers. And we're having these discussions around framing and what it is and what it means to like, think of things from the lens of not the masses, but maybe the vulnerable. And I think so often when we've told stories, like let's talk about homelessness, like we call people homeless as opposed to being unhoused or people without homes or what they are, men and women who like, fell on bad times, who, are struggling with, mental health disorders or maybe like other issues. Like instead of like giving them a label and telling the story from above about them, instead of telling it from the ground and letting them tell their story. That is the difference in framing. And it's like using that camera lens in the artwork, like who is digesting this art? That is important as well. And so if as a writer, I come to the table already with, a little bit more compassion and like wanting to talk about the humanity of people, then that's allowing people to just like give them a microphone and tell their stories. That's one thing I love about like podcasting now. Like we get to hear their voices kind of uninterrupted. The texture of their voices, the emotion of their voices, something that is kind of lost in the writing sometimes because of space more than anything. And now we have that with podcasting, and we hear that with the LA Times. They had their new podcast, The Daily, and it's just so great hearing the texture of people's voices and that emotions in that. But we also can do that by just giving them the space, giving them the floor in an article to like just tell their story and just kind of sit back and just kind of be the conduit to tell it. And that's where I think about framing makes all the difference. And you can put that stuff on words, but it's also having editors who, respect the writer's voice and respect the people who are telling their stories to allow that to get into the pages and online. And I found this last year, like, for young writers, that's kind of hard to kind of push back with editors. Like anyone, you start a new job, you can't tell people this is how I want to do it. You still have a lot to learn. You have to learn the rules before you break them. And like, as I felt like I've been able to find my voice like with different editors and the more I've gotten into this industry. And so now I'm like helping other young writers do that as well through our internship program and through our fellowship program, because it's so important. Like I just can't do this job. Like, there's me in every newsroom and there are other people who are like way better than me that I aspire to be like. I mean, I love reading the work of my colleagues at other papers and within my pages as well. But it's also on us to like bring up that next generation, give them the lessons we've learned, tell them the missteps, do not like make it all sugary. Like, and like part of that is like, hey, I wish I would have done this differently. Next time you do this story, this is great, but like tilt the lens of that camera a little bit and aim it to the vulnerable and tell their story and give them the microphone.
Powerful, powerful, powerful. Um, Angel, you don't know this, but both of our works definitely intersected
Mm-hmm.
this past year, particularly through the pandemic. Because at the Autry, I'm spearheading with an amazing team the Collecting Community History Initiative and its connections to to communities during the pandemic and working beside them to aggregate archival materials through the shelter in place all the way through this vaccination process. And like you did the same thing for the LA Times during the pandemic, but in a hyper focused way and in a hyper local way as well. Can you share with us some of those stories you captured during the pandemic, particularly of the African American community? Because I think, and I argue, I probably will be using some of these references and stories you synthesized in future exhibitions just because of how accurate you were in telling the story. So,
Well,
sure,
thank you.
elaborate.
It's so crazy that like, we're a year into this pandemic and like it's not officially over. Like outside is open, people the masks are off, but we're still very much in a pandemic and people want to forget. but it's important that we don't, because like these are, again, stories that will shape our families and our people for generations. It's important that we remember how it felt, what we did, the fear, all of those things during this time. And so as I was doing this at the LA Times as a reporter covering Black LA, this is where I want to ask you guys to cue some of the photos, because I think these photos are so incredibly powerful and really get to the heart of the people that trust me with their story. So I'm at home, like so many other people, sheltering in place. I can't go to work. I have to work from home. There's no daycare. I have a toddler. She's all over the place. But I also feel this innate, and I'm scared too. I forgot to tell you that part. Like I am at this point terrified because of all the convergence of this disease and what was happening within the country. And it just had my mind going. But let me pour that into my work, because if I'm feeling this way, others have to be too. Like, let me not make this about me. Let me think about all the other people who are just as frightened, who can't find toilet paper, who can't pay their bills. Like I actually literally saw the lines forming in my neighborhood, because I live in South LA, as people were looking to get food. I'm like, let me tell their stories. So I end up telling the story of Black barbershops and and hairstylists in South LA. There's so much of the backbone of the Black community. It's a way that you can be an entrepreneur, you can set your own hours. And it's something so much about feeling and looking good that, like, for Black people, your barber's like your therapist. You're telling them all the family business. You are talking to them about, your troubles and your joys and happiness. You're going there when you're like got job interviews and when you got the job. And like so much of these, it's such a community place that I wanted to tell the story of what happens when you are forced to close. And I found this underground world of barbershops and hairstylists where they're like, we have to continue doing our jobs or we don't have any money. Like, this is a cash business. They don't have the same paperwork to be able to apply to qualify for the PPP loans. And so I'm like, and some of them said they applied many times and were rejected. And so I actually was able to talk to them, and they trusted me with their stories of like, this is a guy right here, Donde, this was his t-shirt shop that was doing so well before the pandemic. He was printing t-shirts for soccer and basketball and football teams and parties. Like, it was really taking off. It'd been there for a year, and there was his second business. His first was cutting hair, and he had to turn the back of his t-shirt shop into this very speakeasy like barbershop. And you can see all the stuff in the background, the printers, all of those things. And like how you got up there, like he had all these kind of barricades with like construction and like a sliding little door where he was yelling out to people. It was very much like Prohibition in the 1920s and that whole speakeasy vibe. And he wasn't doing it to be fancy. He was doing it to make a living, to be able to survive. And this is, him telling me the story and telling me how like he had to shut down one business. He was barely holding on to the second one by having this clandestine barbershop. And when I was talking to them, they were getting fines too. Tia Rose, the woman with the long braids, she was moving from Airbnb to Airbnb doing hair. Wow. Because she needed to make the money, because when she had covered her windows, they had fined her for that. And so she's like, well, let me find something different. And like Jason Armand, one of the photographers at the LA Times, captured this moment so beautifully. And there was just such desperation. And when I was talking to them, this was like, so much of the pandemic was about life or death. And this is like their economic life or death. This is about them feeding their family, roof over their head. They were putting their lives at risk, make sure other people felt and looked good, but also to provide for their family. And this is like things we have to think about during the pandemic. And I wrote these stories, and people reached out to me like, what can we do to help them? Like, what can be done to make sure that, these people who weren't qualifying for PPP, who were actually like being rejected for it, who desperately needed it, can get some kind of assistance. And like, I passed on the support to them, and they were thankful, but in the end, like, they had to do this to survive.
And this was one of those stories that I came across. I want to even say on IG or Twitter. It was like, and I remember how significant it was for to see my experience as a Black man not being able to have gotten a haircut over 3 to 4 month periods, which is a rarity
Yeah.
based off my routine. And when you captured these stories and you showed this prohibition era or esque moments of like survival of and even the ways in which our outward expression is an inward reflection or an inward you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
You told it with such sensitivity and with respect that like I was deeply moved just as much as the rest of the community for you to reflect that, and it's really profound. But you also talked about in your last response, you were talking about life and death, and when you're considering life and death, you also have to consider how the pandemic impacted a lot
Yeah.
of communities' mental health. And I remember when I was preparing for this conversation, I saw an interview you did last year or in the past year with your colleagues, and you talked about this tension you felt about wanting to bear witness to this moment in history as a journalist, but also the desire for your employer to also the desire for your employer for you to work from home as much as possible. Can you expound a little bit further on that tension and what it means to bear witness as a Black journalist, especially for moments like this with regarding hair and other things too?
So I've told this story like mostly by phone, and I actually went to the speakeasy, Don Day Settles speakeasy, like barbershop, but I was told not to. I was told like, hey, you have to be safe. You know, it's our company guidelines that you don't do this right now. But I was like, I can't tell this story accurately unless I like go and see what's actually happening, unless I see the emotion on his face, talk to the people who are there. Some things cannot be done over the phone. And, you know, I got my N95 mask and, you know, I was in and out. I tried not to stay in there too long. But there's just, and then all of this converged right as we're having unrest over George Floyd's death. And and we have a pandemic. We have all these things converging at one time where like it's innate for a journalist to go and capture these moments. But as a Black journalist, like what we've seen over the last, like what, 10 years, like the importance of bearing witness, whether that's with a phone in your hand or as a person as a secondhand account of what they're seeing and what's happening. And actually for me as a journalist, putting this in the pages and having the knowledge of all of what's happened to the Black community and have that perspective to add another layer of depth when I actually go out and do the reporting. And so I want to do that. I want to be there, you know, and it's just, it was heartbreaking to be able to told to kind of like, just make some calls from your office, like make some calls from like, oftentimes my car was my office at the time, because I had my little one in the home and my husband was there as well.
Mhm.
But I wanted to be on the ground. I wanted to be telling those stories because this impacts my community. And I know that I have a different way of viewing things and seeing things that could add to this, because I've been covering South LA now for almost a decade. And you know, I've talked to enough people about the 1992 unrest and what it was called and how it converged into different things at different moments, the emotions of it. And so it was like, honestly, like my observations, like watching television and a simple tweet about how like South LA is being untouched, but look at the playgrounds of the rich being destroyed by, you know, protesters.
Mhm.
And that tweet turns like, oh, that's a story. Like that's that knowledge of knowing that there's so much fear worried of what's going to happen to our community because it impacts us. Like it's natural to, you know, have rage at home, but to think that this rage now was like put against a system that was outside their community, because people remembered. Like that's the perspective that I brought, then actually turned into another story that really helped people understand what was happening in this moment. Why was the Grove and the farmers market and Beverly Hills, you know, why people are converging there and not in the streets of South LA. But I think it's important that we, again, just keep bringing up more people who can do this. It shouldn't just be one. You know, I felt that way because at the time I was the only Black reporter in Metro. And that was that way for so many years. And so I was just like, I have to be on the ground. But since then, things have changed. Like I got promoted. I'm in a different role where I told them I want to find 10 people who can tell these kind of stories at minimum. Like, let's get as many people as we can. And then like we're doing more to expand in our newsroom. So like I'm happy with where things are going. I'm happy to be there to help them find the talent, to help to support talent, because it's one thing bringing people in, it's another to support them. And be able to give them the resources to do their best work, to give them the space to do that, to give them the time off, the push for them to take the time off to do that work. I think this last year we've been working nonstop. And so I've been really telling people like, no, don't call me on your vacation. Like take the time off, you need it, you deserve it. But all of that is coming full circle to like bearing witness and being there in person and being able to see the emotions, to write that in a book, to not miss that sign that someone marked up, to like know the reference of the quote that is being scribbled on the wall. Like all of that stuff is important. And, you know, we are doing that in our own ways, whether that's from our computer screens, our telephones, but all of us are taking in what is actually happening. And like, we should write it down and collect those memories like you're doing for the next generation, so it's not lost.
Powerful. And I'm curious to know, from a mental health perspective for Black journalists like you, um, based off the sensitivity of the topics that dovetail with trauma that you have to record for your role, that definitely has adversity at the center often. How do you counter, or how do Black journalists like yourself counter the weight of those things through self care to navigate the work that you do? Because last year, particularly after the George Floyd protests, it was very clear the ways in which burnt out was felt for many, from activists to journalists alike.
I think more people are talking about therapy than ever before. And like I'm even seeing on, you know, not just within our news organization, but also the news industry as a whole, people talking about the importance of taking time off, to switching, you know, beats and topics to the stories. Like not every story has to be serious. Do another story about joy, do another story about resilience, do just a story about animals, if that's what you need to kind of cleanse the palette in between those stories of trauma. But I know more than anything, like we really push to make sure that we have people take therapy. And we, at my job, we also have like, it's called like employee assistance program, where you can call someone and a therapist will be on a line and they'll
Awesome.
set you up with, you know, several free sessions, because it's often hard to get a therapist. If you do not have one immediately, like it is hard once you are in crisis to get one. So that's also something I really recommend. Find you someone to have, to like, so you can call them, you can get in a week, or but if not, like take advantage of the resources that your employer has, because we have them at the LA Times. I know so many other people have them and we just don't know what they are. Keep the number in your phone, take advantage of these benefits. Like I have it in my phone so I can share with colleagues when I can tell something is going wrong. I'm mindful how people are responding on Twitter and inside internal messages. Like you can tell when people are on edge, and like we should take care of each other and do something about that, and like help them say like, hey, you know, take some time off. And that's what we've been doing as well, taking time off, you know, just trying to unplug. Like I have learned, like before the pandemic, unplugging, just, I don't know what that meant before, but now it means like deleting everything off my phone, like deleting all the apps, because it's so easy to be sucked in. Like I get so much joy from work. So I was always constantly working when I was on vacation. Now, like for the first time, I deleted every app and it was so liberating.
Wow. Wow.
And I cannot tell you, people should do that every 6 months.
Well, yes.
Have you ever done that before? Have you deleted all the apps on your phone? And
I think if anything, this pandemic has taught me what healthy boundaries look like and how unhealthy my boundaries were before I had to work in the same place that I slept.
yeah,
And with that reflection, it taught me, oh well, this is how you manage your time effectively, and this is also how you can unplug in a healthy way as well.
yeah,
So I know what you mean 100%.
yeah,
And I want to ask you a few questions about this racial reckoning, but in a moment,
yeah,
particularly in the LA Times. But I want to bring in more about the history of this all, of both of our works.
yeah.
And given like the rich history of the Black press in California and Los Angeles through outlets like the California Eagle,
Mm-hmm.
the Liberator, and the Los Angeles Sentinel, and the Los Angeles Standard newspaper, how do Black journalists like you connect to the rich history of the Black journalism of the past? It's kind of a big question, but I feel like you definitely can give us an answer.
we stand on each other's shoulders. Like before me, there were other reporters who've had to go through, whether that was issues of not getting the stories they want, not getting the responsibilities, not getting the job. And those who got in the door and had to endure, we stand on their shoulders and keep building on that and help the next generation and hope that the next person does not have to go through what we went through and help them make it a more smoother transition. More recently in my new role, I have been connecting with people at other presses at the Standard and at the Sentinel, and it's great. I actually really like that. I was on a panel with one of the managing editors at the Standard, and I was telling everyone to subscribe to their paper because I do like subscribe to the LA Times too, because we can't claim to appreciate and want to know these stories if we're not willing to pay to make sure that these stories, there's a home for these stories. There are people who have to do this work, and to do that, we have to make sure that we support them. And I was definitely I love the work that they're doing. There's just some people who will only read the Sentinel, and I really appreciate that. And it's also my job to win those people to trust the LA Times as well, so I can tell their stories as well. But I know that so much of what we do is standing on the shoulders of Dorothy Gilliam. She's this trailblazer. She actually has a book called Trailblazer. She was at the Washington Post, and she was the first Black female reporter there. And I did not know this, but when I met her and got to know her, she's a mentor to me. She brought me into journalism when I was a teenager. Connected me with the people and the programs to help, because she knew I had an interest in writing. And so I stand on her shoulders. I know what she went through. And it's about acknowledging those who've already done this before, respecting what they've done, thanking them, and also taking that torch and taking it a little bit further.
Yeah, which is I feel that same passion through your work and through your words. That not only do you stand on the shoulders of those who came before you, but you're also on top of your shoulders. You're building a platform for those to stand on.
Oh, I'm trying. I am trying so hard.
And that's incredible. Which allows me to dovetail back into the reckoning question. Yeah. Because it dovetails with how you're changing it. So the first one that I want to ask, in the last year, the LA Times offered really chiefly an overdue examination of itself, yep, particularly around the failures on race and an apology and a path forward. Can you talk to us what that reckoning was like, particularly for a outlet in legacy media, and some of the steps you may or may not still see happening within the field that makes it easier for those to stand on your shoulders?
Yeah, so this was again, right when the whole world was convulsing because we were forced to sit at home and watch or hear about the gruesome video of George Floyd. We start, at the LA Times, starting to excavate and look at our coverage and what we did and didn't do right and how we covered that story. But then how we treated and mistreated those who were responsible for telling those stories and who wasn't there to tell them the stories because of, past failures. And it was actually really cathartic to all the things that had been discussed behind the scenes, to share them openly, and to also be at a point where people were receptive to hear it. It's so easy to to brush someone off and say, oh, you guys are complaining. But I was so taken aback by how everyone stopped, from the top up and listened. The owner of the LA Times listened and really heard us and felt with deep emotion, the experience of the Black and Latino journalists at the paper. And it has really pivoted our paper. We're at an incredible place where we're doing more hiring, we're telling more stories, we're thinking about framing and who's telling the story. I'm proud of where we are, but it was a lot of pain before then. As I mentioned, I was for many years the only Black reporter covering local news. And that was an incredibly lonely position to be in. It's also a very weighty position to be in, to have all of that responsibility of telling a community of 2 million people. That's how many people are in South LA. But the South LA, it's Compton, it's also Inglewood, it's Watts, it's these neighborhoods that make up South LA that you're responsible for telling their stories, how things are changing, impacting them and like the joys and all of those things. And it was a lot. And they understood it. They heard me, and they made active changes to like find an accountability person. They said, we're going to do better. In fact, we're going to hire someone to make sure we do better. And like after a lengthy interview process, like I got the job. Like it was a very lengthy process. I'm so happy that they trusted in me to be able to like not be a diversity and inclusion editor. Like, no, that's everyone's job. My job is to make sure everyone else is doing their job, to help make it easier to work with them when they're like hitting roadblocks, and like they're doing that. And it's, you can tell the difference in the pages of our story, of our newspaper and on our website. But in addition to that, like I'm just thinking about all the work that we're doing and the hiring that we're doing, and then that like the reckoning we did. Like they not only did they say we're going to do better, you can't move forward without atoning for the past. Like they like there was over a couple of days we did a series on Eastern apology about how we painted communities in the past. We allowed people who are harmed in the process, journalists, to share their stories, as well as communities. And since then, other papers have done it. The Kansas City Star. I've been reached out to by other newspapers, other college papers, other colleges and universities, saying like they're planning to do the same. Can we give them the blueprint? And it's been like incredibly like eye-opening to see that something that came from such a place of hurt, we were able to like inspire so many other people to think deeply about where they had their failures as well, and have been trying to like model what we've done to like make atonement and do better.
Incredible, and kudos to your work and the reverberations of that work across the field and nation. It's so vital, and allows me to ask you the question I'm excited to hear about. The precursor to the question I'm really excited to hear about is like your approach to mentorship. We've talked about the blind spots of newspapers, but we're also seeing a new resurgence of creating valuable pipelines into the newsroom. And I know you recently started your summer internship class and expressed the diversity in that cohort. I was really inspired by the diversity of the photo when I saw. Can you expound on that and your role in how you see mentorship within journalism play out?
I know everybody who's watching this, probably they're all employed. They have some company, or maybe they're entrepreneurs. Like, do what you can to start an internship program. Like, it is so valued to helping the next generation. When I was a summer intern, I did 4 summer internships, and it just really helped me cut my teeth and like to make those mistakes and get valuable hands-on experience. And I'm not mean like have people make you coffee, have them, if write your emails and like help them back read, like writing powerful emails, have them work alongside you if you're doing architect or whatever the case may be. It's so important to like, again, pour into the next generation to help them do to help fill your shoes one day, because you could be training your future boss. That's what I always think about as I'm working with the interns. So now I'm in charge of the summer internship program, and we had a smaller class last year due to COVID. It was just 9 interns, and then we had partnerships with universities. Now, as you can imagine, the universities that paid for interns to get the experience at the LA Times are oftentimes universities with endowment or the money to do that, and their classes are not as diverse, and their students are not as diverse as what the nation looks like, or even LA. Let's think about LA and California. And so, as I took on this program, like normally we get like about 1,000 applications for summer internships, and we had 9 slots the previous year. And so I did some outreach because I wanted to make sure we think about the Cal States, which is like so vital. It's like such a pipeline for people who, first generation students to get out of poverty, and like be able to do that. You don't have Cal States don't have the same resources as a Stanford or Harvard. So I think it was very important for me to go to those schools and talk to them, to encourage the students to apply, because like you can't get an internship if you don't apply. You have to put your name in the hat. And so I spent the time like talking to so many students and doing so many information sessions and encouraging people. And in 2019, I think when we looked at the applications, only like 13 Cal State students had applied for the internships out of the 1,000. And so this year, when under me, it was like 1,100 people applications, and like we had, like 115, 113 Cal States. So like now you have a more diverse pool. Now you really can see like, okay, let's pick the best people. And then there's so many great people that we expanded our internship program from 9 to 25. And then we continued also working with partnerships as well, from other schools. But as I'm talking to these schools and I'm looking at the students that bring in me, I'm telling them like, hey, I'm looking at this. I don't see any Black or Latino students at all in your of your journalism students. Like, what's going on there? Like, like you are a pipeline for us. Like, how can we help you make sure you're recruiting the right students too and giving them opportunities? Because I was that student. Like, I'm first generation person going to college in my family. It was so important for me to get my foot in the door at a university that supported me, but then helped me and encouraged me to apply for internships. Like, I was like, what can we do? You're part of the pipeline too. I can't continue working with you if I don't see a different pool of candidates, in the future, because it's on all of us to be bringing up journalists that look like the communities that we cover. And so that's how we just got such a beautiful mix of people to tell these stories, because like it's the outreach, it's the encouragement, and then like providing the space to recruit more people. There was no mandate. Like I actually was hearing from some like, oh, we should set one slot aside for Cal State students. I think we ended up having 5 Cal State students. I said, no, there's no need to put a number on it. Like, we're going to pick the best people, and we got the best people. And it so happened 5 of them were Cal State students. And like, that's just because they were good. Like, I mean, I think, that system can work, but if we do the work and doing the outreach and the support, it'll show up naturally.
Your response makes me so proud to have gone to a Cal State and to see, had it not been for individuals like you who saw talent early from state schools, how valuable of an experience it has been for students out of state schools just like me. So thank you for that emphasis, and also looking back out for that.
I think it's so important. Like, it just, we say like, oh, get a good education, go to these schools, and then we reward only the people who go to like a school with a fancy title. Like, that's great. Like, those students are worthy as well, and they should definitely be judged as well, and for their accolades. But it's also important to think about the other barriers of entries for other people to get into. Like, some people don't have, I'm at a paper. So like, in order to be able to apply for a summer internship, you have to have clips or writings to show that you published at a school newspaper. That's often hard to do if you work a second job or you working while doing school. So that's where I come in as I'm talking to them and saying like, you only have to do a couple stories. This is how you balance it. Try doing some freelance work where you actually paid, so it offsets, you having to work or your less hours, like giving them the keys to their future and helping them along the way. Like, I think that is just so important that it's on all of us, not just me, not just you, all of us, to think about how can we help the next generation.
Incredible. And this leads us to our last question before our Q&A. So for those of us who are watching, for those of you who are watching, feel free to drop in your questions into the Q&A so we can read them shortly. But Angel, you and I both live in Los Angeles. We both have proximity to South Los Angeles, and we're also a home of some of the most important musical acts that Black America has ever seen, but also have descended or come out of Black Los Angeles. Some of which has been Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin. Motown has moved to LA, but of course NWA, Kendrick Lamar, and of course Nipsey Hussle. Particularly regarding Nipsey Hussle, you provided one of the strongest snapshots of Los Angeles' Crenshaw district and its native son through Nipsey Hussle, through your story. Can you share more about that story, about him, and why it was so vital to capture those angles and the humanity of the Black experience in the inner city? And I know you have some photos as well.
Oh yeah, you can cue those up. This is also where it comes to, again, reclaiming your story and like having the people in place. So like, Nipsey Hussle is a rapper like, when the alert goes out, is rapper dead, shot in broad daylight. For LA, this feels very familiar. It feels like the 90s when Notorious B.I.G. was shot and killed off Fairfax. It wasn't in broad daylight, but still, like, it felt very familiar. It brings us back to Tupac, who died not too far away in Vegas. And that's how natural reflex, like all newspapers, we tell kind of stories the same. We tell the wildfire stories. We know the ingredients we need to make that cake. And so because it felt like we've done this story before, the natural reflex is to tell the story about his death. But I live in the neighborhood. I was used to seeing his billboard. I knew what he was doing. I actually was like working on doing a story about him before he died. And so I already had in mind what he meant to the community. So that was my angle. Told my coworkers, yes, it's great. Tell the story of, his death, because that's important too. Who shot him? Why? What's going on there? But I'm going to tell the story of his life, that he was a father, that, he was a brother, that the community loved him, and why. And as I did that, we're in a digital age, we could see that more people were reading that story about what he meant to the community. The gruesome murder and the investigation was less of what readers wanted. They wanted to know about his life. They wanted to know, like, why they were grieving so hard. They knew bits and pieces, but for someone to, again, connect those dots, provide that connective tissue of his work and activism and what that meant to the Black community and the Black communities across this nation. And so as you're seeing right here, this is like giving me goosebumps. It's so powerful. All the people that took to the streets to honor him and remember him. It was a parade. And we don't see that often for somebody celebrated in this way. People came from all over to see him. So as I told the story, like, it was important to talk about his life and to talk about those who knew him best. And that was his family. And, again, trust, I was in the community. People knew my name. I got his brother's number. His brother called me and, told me about those final moments as he tried to save him. And that just kept going on to more stories about, the work he was doing, to how he bought that strip mall right off Crenshaw and Slauson, the pressures of gentrification, his run-ins with the law, and how that impacted, what he was trying to do as a businessman and a community man to revitalize his community. And I was able to do those stories incrementally that just talked about his life and legacy. And I just got so much response from readers saying, like, they appreciated that. Like, this is what they want to hear about their community. It's not all about death. It's about the life that they live, that little, like the hyphen in the middle that talks to, about that life lived. And so I was able to tell his story in a way that really talked about the community, because he was from the community. He was of the community. Everyone knew him. And it was great to be able to talk about my neighborhood in a way that now everyone knows about Crenshaw. It was because Nipsey and these stories as well. Like, I can go anywhere and be like, oh yeah, I wrote the story, but I'm also from the community, and people know exactly what that meant.
And it was that story that moved me so deeply, as among all the other millions of people who've read it. And so thank you for providing Ermias Asghedom the proper light he deserved, as well as the Crenshaw district. And your work continues to tell the value of Black life over and over and over. Now I would love to transition into the Q&A portion to take some of the questions that our viewers have, and so I can field them to you. We have some good ones too.
We do. I'm seeing.
I'll read them over to you, and then you can just to field them. So the first one we have is if whether you have any info on the pending sale of the Crenshaw District's Baldwin Hills Shopping Center, or anything brewing about that important place.
The Baldwin Hills Crenshaw Plaza is such a staple in the community. And I know that has undergone many different hands over the last couple of years and been like in the midst of sales. I do know that there is a lot of actually conflict right now about who is trying to buy it now. And I have been kept in a loop, but I am no longer writing, and that has been brought onto the business side, and they're planning to tell that story because it's an important one. Like, I know so many people care about what that mall is, who will end up with ownership of that mall. But more than anything about who's the owner, we also as community members have to patronize that mall. Like, I have seen shops go because they're not the people there, but it's not too far from my house. So I try to do what I can to visit it. And because I just love the melanin market that's there, the farmers market that's there. It's just so important to keep these things and these traditions in our community. But please subscribe to the LA Times so you can read. We've done previous stories on this. Like in the last year, we've done 2 stories on the mall, and I know there's another one coming up.
That's a great one. The next question we have is, what role do you see the Autry having in talking about Black stories in the press? And I can come behind you too with my own thoughts afterward.
Yeah, I think it's so vital that museums do like collect all this rich material and also be there to synthesize it for, a different audience as well. Because I feel like we as a community, we are many communities. We are a community of readers, a community of moviegoers, of musicians, and all of these places should be able to bring Black stories in their capacity to an audience that should be made aware of them. I'll let you go. This is more in your wheelhouse, but I do think it's just so important that everyone plays a vital role in making sure the
Absolutely.
stories are told and displayed.
Absolutely. I've had the privilege of working with some great teams to produce exhibitions about the Black press in the American West. And I also see vital opportunities to tell those more stories about the Black press at the Autry as one of the curators. And it's finding fantastic journalists like you and working alongside you in collecting these community stories. So when the time comes for exhibition preparation and ideation, I already have the sources. I can't tell you how many exhibitions I've had the privilege of doing in the past where my primary sources beyond people, or my secondary sources beyond primary sources, was the newspapers that wrote about these accounts and the slanted perspectives they had about African Americans at the time, and using that as a lens to show what the temperature was for race in the United States. And so I see many opportunities in this, for those who are watching this conversation between Angel and I. This is just the beginning of a very long relationship in making sure the stories of the Black press meets the museums.
Yes.
We have more questions, and they're kind of spilling in. This question is, as a journalist, what is the trajectory of newspapers and media in general? And do you see it as telling stories or telling facts, or a combination of both?
So everyone thinks that newspapers are dying, and I don't see how do newspapers die when people need information. When people share stuff on Twitter and social media and Facebook, like what they're sharing is snippets from newspapers that they just didn't source. Like you can't say how many people died without, knowing that first it came from a newspaper, a person who called the authorities and made sure it was verified, and it really put their reputation on the line to make sure that stuff was truly accurate, and then give it to a wider audience and not just speculation and hearsay. And so I just find there'll be different ways that we'll continue connecting. We'll find more ways to do this through other mediums as people as attention just continue to grow in different direction. Not everyone's is converging and sitting with the newspaper. Now they're listening through their ears, and they have podcasts. And that's why the LA Times has the daily podcast. They are consuming it on television. That's why we have stuff on Netflix now where you can watch some of our stories on TV. It's just so many other things that we're doing to make sure we can get people to understand the work that we're doing, the facts we're gathering, the stories we're telling in a way to meet them where they are. And storytelling is also doing the digging in the work of finding facts as well. We're not just allowing people to have free range. It's also then looking in the history books. It's also talking to academia, talking to people in museums who know this information and putting it up against facts. We don't just allow people to make, blanket statements, but there's a way of telling facts in story form that just makes you want to sit with the story that much longer and allow you to feel it, And so yes, we can tell the facts, but we also want you to feel them and the weight of them. And that's where, the art of storytelling comes in as well.
We have another question from Lillian Wilson that says, Angel, you are so inspiring and courageous.
Thank you.
Is there one story that really moved you the most so far, or changed the direction of your outlook in a surprising way?
One that moved me was I told the story of a nurse who watched her dad dying in the hospital where she worked during COVID. And that story just like resonated with me so much. And as I was writing it, like I literally was in tears. Like I also lost an aunt to COVID. And so I honored her through that story by like sharing this woman's stories. And as I talked to her about like how challenging that was, she told me like, I'm only talking to you because like, I felt you can tell my story because you just seem empathetic. You seem like you understand, like you're like me, I appreciate you telling my dad's story. And like even talking to people, it was like a ski club. And I had talked to some people like, people were talking to me like, Black people ski, like they're like, why isn't that the story? I was like, because it's not a story. Black people ski, I ski, my editor who's Black skied. Like that is not new, it's new to you, and it's okay that that's new to you. But the story is about this man and his life and like what happened when they all converged for their annual ski trip, which is something they had done for years. And it was a moment of celebration, but it also was sadness because COVID was, in the mix as they were celebrating. Two of the skiers being inducted to the National Hall of Fame for skiers, which was a huge feat. They applied 3 times and this was the 3rd time and they got it. And that story just hit me so hard because it was around the time my aunt passed away and we were in the pandemic, and you could really tell the grief of this family and what Chuck meant to everybody. Like, I got to talk to his ski buddies, his son, all of them. And it was just really an honor to tell his story and to also in a way teach people about Black skiers.
Wow. And and Angel, this is exactly why I wanted to talk to you because these type of nuances that you've been able to amplify completely wrinkles exactly what those who have preconceived notions about our
Yeah.
community
Yeah.
may not know, believe, or understand, but it's so intimate to our lives. So
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an amazing skier or nothing like that, but I would risk my life going down a slope. And
right.
I thought that was just like important to be able to tell that story of, this community that
Sure.
really like also gave back so much. That was also part of what they did, was teaching young people about skiing, constantly reaching back,
Yeah.
and like I just think that's so true for our community. And I was just honored to tell that story.
Amazing.
It just touched me in such a way.
Incredible. We had one more question, and it was, can you tell us more on the Collecting Community History Initiative? Of course, the reason why we're here, right? The Collecting Community History Initiative, which is the short is CCHI, is the Autry's initiative in telling the stories of those in the American West, and trying to amplify the very real stories, particularly through this pandemic. We've covered 3 iterations thus far in CCHI. It's the COVID-19 pandemic, Black Lives Matter protests in the West, and electoral politics in the West. And the process is ongoing to submit to CCHI so we can capture the stories that history often may just only see on the periphery. And but in order to do that, we need great journalists who tell ripe stories and hopefully amplify those things for more people to hear as well. With that, Angel.
Wait. There was one more question here. I
Oh,
thought it's a good ending. Someone
this was
asked,
to the top. Go ahead. Feel
it said,
free.
as a journalist, do you see partnerships or relationships between museums and the press telling Black stories? And I would love to see this happen. I take my daughter to the California Science Museum all the time, and I see photos that were taken by LA Times reporter and videos and all of those things, because like they have a partnership there and it's part of the exhibit. Like I love it. I would love to see that kind of partnership happen, telling Black stories with museums where we can take, the artifacts that we're collecting as, newspaper men and women, and put them in a museum setting again to expand our audience and to give it to people in a different way. Like, I would love to see that. So, I mean, to me, that's the perfect ending. I think, we should
Oh, it's a perfect
segue.
ending. It's a perfect ending. And you might have inspired a new project on the horizon. We'll talk about that more later. But with that, Angel, thank you. Thank you for joining us today for this Autry Artist Salon. Again, thank you for everyone for taking time to hear more on discussing journalism's power to tell authentic stories about African Americans, both um, past and present. And just please join us on Wednesday, June 30th, with my colleague Josh Garrett Davis, the Autry's Gamble Associate Curator of Western History of Popular Culture and Firearms, as he sits down with Weshat Alvitre, award-winning comics artist and illustrator, and John Mack, the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University. They will be speaking about their forthcoming collaboration, An Illustrated History of California for Young People, and the Historical Imagination thread at the Autry. So you can check more on that at the autry.org slash artist salons. But overall, thank you, Angel. You are a star,
Thank you
and
for
we will be
having me.
following your work, and we look forward to ripe collaborations in the future as well.
Thank you so much for having me. This was amazing.
No, thank you. And you all have a great rest of your afternoon. We look forward to seeing you soon.